Assalamu alaikum. Insha'Allah ta'ala, we're going to start reading a fiqh book, and the book that we'll be reading is called Al-Ajwabatul Jaliyatu fil Ahkam al-Hanbaliyah, which translates to the clear answer or reply in the Hanbali rulings. This is a book authored by Sheikh Musa bin Isa al-Qadumi rahimahullah, and alhamdulillah, we studied this book with our Sheikh Dr. Mustafa Ulyan hafazahullah. Before we start reading the book, we're first going to have a brief kind of introduction on some of the important scholars as well as books of the madhab to kind of explain how we got to the book that we're going to be studying here. So this is based upon an introduction that our Sheikh Dr. Mustafa hafadhahullah gave for us. I have added a few supplementary details that he didn't mention, but it's more or less as he has given to us. So first off, in case you don't have any background or limited background in the Hanbali madhab, when we talk about the madhab, it's usually divided into 3 phases, and these phases have to do with activities that were going on in each phase. So the first phase would start from the time of Imam Ahmed, we can say from his death in 241, up until the time of Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la, who died in the year 458, and these years that I'm giving you are all going to be in Hijr years. So it was during this time where the different narrations of Imam Ahmed were collected on the different issues and compiled. Then the next phase, it starts with one of the students of Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la named Al-Kalwadhani, who died in the year 510, and most scholars agree it continues up until the time of Ibn Muflih, who died in the year 763. So during this time, the main focus was on trying to identify the mu'tamid, or the relied upon position. So please try to become familiar with these words if you're not familiar with them. So the mu'tamid, or the relied upon position, because in different issues there may have been more than one narration related from Al-Imam Ahmed about his opinion, and usually they try to find the last opinion that Al-Imam Ahmed had to identify the mu'tamid. Finally, the last phase of the madhab starts from Ala ad-Din al-Mardawi, who died in the year 885, and continues up until now. There is no idea that we have a new phase in the madhab, or that we've gone back to re-examine evidence and started to do what some people call finding the most correct or authentic opinion. This is something that's not correct. So from the time of Al-Mardawi to the present time, we're in the 3rd phase of the madhab, which was mainly focused on verification of those positions, meaning identifying the mu'tamid position and settling the madhab. It doesn't mean that we still can't find some minor differences on points, but for people especially at our level of understanding, for any of these books that were authored in the later phase, including the book that we'll be reading, you're fine to follow it. You don't need to worry about some of these minor points where there still could be some difference of opinion. So now we'll talk about some of the important scholars and their books that contributed to the madhab. First, we're going to start with Al-Imam Wafaq ad-Din Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi. He is one of the most important imams in the madhab, and in fact we consider him second only to Al-Imam Ahmed. So with regards to fiqh, he authored 4 famous books, and we can think of them as kind of in a series for studying. So there's Al-Umda as the first introductory book, then Al-Muqni' as a slightly more advanced book, and then Al-Kafi, which is becoming even more advanced book, and finally Al-Mughni. And Al-Mughni, it's even more like an encyclopedia of fiqh, and he does talk about even some other positions of different scholars, maybe outside of the madhab. And it's not the kind of book that someone would study, because as I said, it's like an encyclopedia, so no one goes to read an encyclopedia. Maybe some scholars have read it, but it's generally more of that kind of a reference book, at least for, once again, students of knowledge at our level. So maybe just to quickly mention 2 points here. The first book in this series, Al-Umda or Umda fil Fiqh, this is a book that we do see some contemporary scholars, especially scholars in Saudi, and those scholars who are influenced by them teaching. And it's not that there's anything wrong with this book, but as we can see, this is a very old book, and there could be instances where it doesn't necessarily relate the relied upon opinion, mu'tamid opinion in the madhab. So that's why generally we don't study this book. Once again, I'm not saying don't study the book, but if one does want to study the book, one should do it with a qualified teacher so they can explain the correct ruling, and likewise a teacher who's on the correct methodology, meaning that they're really following the mu'tamid position in the Hanbali madhab. Because with this book in particular, we see that many people have used this book to do this type of a fiqh, that where they call, the most correct opinion fiqh. So that's just something to watch out for. And the second book in the series, Al-Muqni', now I'm just giving my own opinion, but this could be one of the most important books authored in Hanbali Fiqh. And I'm saying that because when we get to some of the later books, we'll see that they're virtually all based upon this book, Al-Muqni'. Next, after Al-Muwaffaq, and I'll just quickly say we're not going through an exhaustive list of all the scholars and all the books, but we're trying to focus on some of the main and most important ones. So not long after Al-Muwaffaq was Najduddin ibn Taymiyyah. Now, he's sometimes called the grandfather because his grandson, also known as Sheikh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, is maybe more famous. But with regards to our perspective in the madhab, Al-Najd is number 2 after Muwaffaq ad-Din ibn Qudama. And he's also very important because we see that whenever Al-Muwaffaq ibn Qudama and Al-Najd ibn Taymiyyah agree, this is an indication of the mu'tamid position. Now, he authored one famous book called Al-Muharrar, which is in print. So this is one of the important books of the madhab, along with those of the series that Ibn Qudama authored. Now we can move on to the grandson of Al-Majd, so Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. This is the Ibn Taymiyyah that usually we hear about. And he authored several books in fiqh. 2 that we can mention One is a sharh or explanation of Al-Umdah by Ibn Qudama, and this book is in print. I don't know if the full manuscript exists, but the part that's in print is only dealing with the acts of worship, the ibadat. Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he also wrote an explanation, a sharh of his grandfather's book, Al-Muharrar. And unfortunately that book is lost or could be somewhere only in manuscript form, but it's not in print, and as far as I know, nobody knows of it existing. I mean, anything that we still have today that's left of what he authored. So on Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, maybe I'll just quickly mention 2 or 3 things. First, Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he studied fiqh with Ibn Abi Umar, Ibn Qudama, the nephew of Shaykh al-Islam Muwaffaq ibn Qudama, as well as with his father, who took obviously the mathhab from his grandfather, Majd ibn Taymiyyah. That means that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah has one of the strongest chains of transmission in the madhab for fiqh. Very strong chain of transmission coming both from Ibn Qudama and his grandfather Majd. Next, there is some discussion. Was Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, was he a mujtahid, meaning someone who can derive rulings from the core texts of the Sharia? Was he an absolute mujtahid or a mujtahid in the madhab? We don't want to open that door, but I'm just mentioning this because we do see that in this book called Majmu' al-Fatawa, which is a collection of his writings, including some of his fatawa, he does express some opinions, and some of those can be against the Hanbali madhab. Now, there are some opinions that we can say are opinions in the Hanbali madhab, meaning that they were derived through the Hanbali usul, and usul means the guidance of how to derive these rulings. So Imam Ahmed had a certain usul, and those who followed him in the madhab used this usul, and accordingly they derived rulings. Now, we know that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah didn't always use this usul, so that's why we can't go to Majmu' al-Fatawa and open it and take one of his rulings and assume that this is a Hanbali ruling. So please, take note of that. That's why we go to these relied upon books of the madhab to identify the relied upon mu'tamad position. Now, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he died in the year 728, and then not long or directly after him was his student Ibn Muflih, who died in the year 763, and he authored the famous book Kitab al-Furu', where he compiled some of the different narrations in the madhab. And Ibn Muflih was himself also like a genius in fiqh, and some people say he was maybe even on par with his teacher, Allahu A'lam. Now we start to get into the last phase of the madhab, now that we're passing Ibn Muflih. And the first scholar that we'll mention here is Ibn Rajab. He died in the year 795. Now, Ibn Rajab, I think that he is a famous scholar. Probably you've heard of him or some of his books. But interestingly enough, he did not author a book on fiqh. He was very specialized in the science of hadith, and most of the books, if not all the books that he wrote, had to do with the science of hadith. Now, that doesn't mean that, because he didn't write a fiqh book, that we don't know about his fiqh rulings, because he does explain some of them in the books that he wrote. And one of the most important fiqh books that he wrote was Fathul Bari, which was an explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari. Unfortunately, he only finished a small portion of the book, I think somewhere toward the end of the book of prayer. He had completed before he passed away. But nonetheless, this is a book where, for example, we can see some of his opinions on fiqh. And just as a quick side note, this is also the reason that Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani titled his book, which is the explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari, Fathul Bari. It had to do with the fact that Ibn Rajab started the book, that explanation with that name. And although Ibn Hajar's explanation is by far the most famous, who knows if Ibn Rajab was able to have finished his explanation. It probably would have surpassed it. Allahu A'lam. But with regards to Ibn Rajab, if we go back to just thinking about, where he is in the ranking of the madhab, we mentioned after Al-Imam Ahmed, we have Muwaffaq ad-Din ibn Qudama, then Majd ad-Din ibn Taymiyyah, and there's now some difference of opinion. Some people would say it's Ibn Rajab and then Ibn Taymiyyah. Some might say that Ibn Rajab and Ibn Taymiyyah are kind of in a tie for third. It's not really an important issue to get into, but I'm just saying this, and it's not to put Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah down, but there are those people that think Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah is like the greatest scholar that's been on the face of the earth. And while we obviously hold him in extremely high regard, at the same time, we see that he does have a place or position in the Hanbali madhab, and it should be known. Okay, now we can continue on with Ala ad-Din al-Mardawi, who died in the year 885. Now, al-Mardawi was at the beginning of the last phase. He's also known as the Munakka, or the redactor or verifier of the madhab. He was among the Hanabila that were from near Nablus in Palestine. He went to Salihiyah, which is the neighborhood of the Hanbalis in Damascus. These are all things that, inshallah, if you don't know, you should know. He went to Salihiyah. He studied there. Our Sheikh Mustafa, he described him as the ocean of fiqh and usul. He wrote some important books like Al-Insaf and Al-Tankih Al-Mushbi'. The book Al-Insaf is where he's gathered some of the different opinions in the madhab, and Tankih is very important because this is the book where, when he did all of his verification of the madhab, where he put his final position. This was like the last book that he wrote, and the scholars that came after him will always refer to this book and what he's identified as the mu'tamil position in this book. Now we can continue to two more very important scholars. They were living at the same time but in different places, and they've authored some of the most relied upon and most read and most studied books of the madhab. This includes Ibn al-Najjar al-Futuhi. He was an Egyptian. He died in the year 972. He wrote a famous book called Muntaha al-Iradat. This was a summary of Al-Mardawi's Tanqih and Al-Muqni' by Sheikh al-Islam ibn Qudama. So you remember what I mentioned of this book before. And this book, many people would consider it is most accurately depicting the mu'tamid position of the madhab. There could still be some discussion on that, but it's a very relied upon book, and many of the states today that claim they're following Hanbali Fiqh, like Saudiya, they rely on the rulings that are in this book. Next is Sheikh Musa al-Hajjawi. He was based in Damascus. He died in the year 968. He authored some important books. One of the very important books he authored is called Al-Iqna', where he has summarized some of the Ibn Qudama books that we've mentioned earlier, Al-Muharrar by Al-Majd, and also a book called Al-Mustaw'ib by an Iraqi scholar called As-Samuri, who died in the year 616. So this is before Ibn Qudama, but Al-Mustaw'ib is also a very famous book that compiles some of the different opinions in the madhab. So these were some of the main books that he relied on to author Al-Iqna'. Al-Iqna' is often compared with this book that I mentioned from Ibn Najjar called Muntaha al-Iradat. I don't want to say it's like a competition, but just to summarize what many scholars have said, Al-Iqna' by al-Hajjawi discusses more issues than Al-Muntaha, but Al-Muntaha is more specific and more revised. So I'll just leave it at that, but these two books are important because when we see them mentioning the same ruling, that is an indication of the mu'tamid position. Al-Hajjawi, he also authored another book called Zad al-Mustaqni'. This is a summarized version of Al-Muqni' by Ibn Qudama. So once again we see the importance of Al-Muqni', and this is a very popular intermediary level fiqh book. Now that brings us to a Sheikh Al-Buhuti. He was an Egyptian. He died in the year 1051. The scholar Ibn Awad called him Sayyid al-Muhaqqiqeen, or the Sayyid of the authenticators, because Al-Buhuti wrote so many important shuruh or explanations of other books, including Al-Muntaha by Ibn Najjar, Al-Iqna', as well as Zad al-Mustaqni' by Al-Hajjawi, and especially his explanation of Zad al-Mustaqni' called Rod al-Murba' is very important, because when he wrote it there wasn't really an explanation for that book, so it was a huge gap in the literature. But all of these shuruh that he wrote are heavily relied upon. Al-Buhuti is the most important person in the later phase writing these explanations to books. At the same time of Al-Buhuti, we have another important scholar called Mar'i al-Karmi. He was originally from Palestine, from Tulkarm, and he moved to Egypt. So he was also in Egypt at the same time Al-Buhuti was there. He wrote some important books, including Ghayat al-Muntaha And this was a book that was kind of, he was trying to combine Muntaha al-Iradat by Ibn al-Jar, as well as Al-Iqna' by Al-Hajjawi. He's also authored a smaller book called Dalil al-Talib. This was based on Muntaha al-Iradat, but he kind of summarized it in a way and gave it a type of ordering where many people think it's easier to memorize, and I kind of agree with that point. But anyways, Dalil al-Talib is one of the most important and studied fiqh books of the intermediary level. And in fact, the book that we're going to be reading, Al-Ajwaba Al-Jaliyah, it's a summarized version of Dalil al-Talib. So that book, Al-Ajwaba Al-Jaliyah, was, as we mentioned, authored by Sheikh Musa bin Isa al-Qadumi, who died in the year 1336 Hijri, which corresponds to 1908 current era. So we can see that he's a very relatively contemporary scholar compared to some of the other scholars we've mentioned here. Just a few quick notes on the book before we finish here. This is a very beneficial book. It's a book that would probably be taught as the first book for someone to study. So that's why I highly recommend this book if either you've never studied fiqh before, or maybe you were studying fiqh but according to the wrong methodology. So when we look into this book, we'll see that it's mentioning just one opinion that we can accept as the mu'tamad opinion. There might be 2 or 3 issues we'll comment on. Reading this book, it's not going to make you a fiqhi to go and start giving fatwa, but it will explain what you need for all your daily acts of worship and give you, I think, a fairly solid foundation on that. Now, as I mentioned, we studied the book with our Sheikh, Dr. Mustafa Ulyan, and he studied it with one of his Sheikhs, the Sheikh Sideeq bin Musa Sayd, who was the Imam of the Hanbali Jama' or Masjid in Nablus. And Sheikh Sideeq had studied the book with the author. So that means we have quite a short isnad or chain of transmission between us and the author. Alhamdulillah, may Allah bring much barakah and blessing in that, inshallah. So we're going to conclude here. I think we're going to have like maybe 2 more quick sessions before we actually get into the book. So we want to talk about the author. We'll go through kind of a short biography of him, as well as a few comments on the book, and then a few comments on studying and how to study and some of the good manners to observe while studying. So please stay tuned for those. I hope that you've enjoyed this brief summary of some of the important scholars and their books of the Hanbali mathhab. Please don't forget us in your dua, and likewise that of all the Muslims in the world, and especially our scholars, those living and those dead. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.